Hello, everybody, and welcome back. I am the Dependent Fanatic, and today we're talking Michigan running backs throughout history. How has it evolved? In the early days, fullbacks and running backs took part as quarterback. All of them threw the ball. And now we specialize in one position, quarterback, and I already talked about that in a previous video. But we're talking running backs here for this one. So, all Americans and drafted running backs. I'm going to give you a little bit of every one of those that we've had throughout history. We've had 29 All Americans. And at the running back position, that means halfback or fullback. Um, and 58 drafted players at halfback or fullback throughout history. And the draft started in 1936. So most years, except for, the dog years, the dark ages that we just went through, Michigan's been dominant on the ground. All right. The first All-American team was in 1889, excuse me, a long time ago. It took 10 years for Michigan to get a running back All-American in 1899, and that was John McClain, Michigan's first at running back, like I said. No draft back then, no stats back then, so that's basically all we know. He was named All-American. Some people, some writers all agreed, and there you go. Willie Heston, though, in 1904, was a three-time All-American at Michigan. He was 43-0-1 during his time, and 4 national championships. He was part of the point-a-minute teams, and back then, gaining 50-plus points a game was unheard of. It still is today, but, it's more likely today. Back then, they had to just run. Now, all they could do was run. There was no forward pass until 1909, and we'll get to that. But uh, Heston was amazing. During his time at Michigan, he outscored opponents. The team outscored opponents 2,326 to 40. Heston had 18 rushes and 170 yards in the first ever Rose Bowl. Stats, like I said, were not accurately kept track of until 1949. So we can only imagine what this guy did. He was the heart of that point-a-minute team. All right, or those teams. So, without missing a beat, the very next year we had another All-American in 1905, Thomas Hammond at running back. Again, no stats. Dave Ellerdiss in 1909 was an All-American for Michigan at running back. Someone in Ohio recorded the first forward pass during this season. Someone from an Ohio college team. We don't know. Remember, teams like Chicago and Yale and Harvard are all big at this time. So, Joe Magnuson in 1910 was a 2-time All-American running back for Michigan. And then James Craig in 1913 was an All-American. John Maltbesh in 1916 got his third All-American status. And in 1917, Cedric Smith was an All-American at fullback for Michigan, and we have 3 of these here in consecutive order. Frank Steketee in 1918 was an All-American fullback. Franklin Kappen in 1922 was an All-American fullback. So we adjusted. We gave the ball to the guy. Back then, the fullback was the furthest back, not the biggest guy. He was the best runner at that time, from my research. So Harry Kipke, though, is a name that you all should be familiar with. In 1923, he was a 2-time All-American and would later become head coach at Michigan and win national titles as player and coach. And then it was 10 years before we had another All-American in the backfield, and it was Herman Eberhardus in 1933. Fun fact, he got Gerald Ford his first job ever. Former President Gerald Ford, and All-American in his own right at his position. on the line. He got his first job waiting tables for the fraternity that they were both in. So that's a fun fact that the former president was waiting tables in his first paid job. So, but anyway, then it took a while again, 7 more years before we got another All-American, but it was one of the greatest of all time. Tom Harmon, 1940, had his second All-American status. He was the second Heisman Trophy winner of all time, and if the committee or whoever was deciding that in the first one didn't rule that it should be a senior, he would have won it twice with the stats that he had. He was drafted #1 overall, but that's what's more amazing is he fought in World War II as a pilot. He was a sole survivor of a plane crash. Like many during this time, Michigan football players were enlisted. He came back after the war and did broadcasting and became a movie star. So there you go. What a legend he is. And his son is Mark Harmon. You know him from NCIS, Gibbs, and he directs that thing and everything. So, and he was a former player at USC, right? So. Great lines there. Tom had a 19-4-1 record as a starter at Michigan, and yes, he's listed at a running back because that's what he was. He played halfback, but he passed the ball. He played quarterback in a game versus Ohio State. That's very interesting. They did it all, but he led the nation in yards per game with 108.5 in 1939. 20 more than anyone else in the nation. 20 yards per game more. And he was a junior. That's what I'm saying. He probably should have won the first Heisman. He led in scoring, too, that season. So, in 1940, Tom Harmon had 844 yards, which didn't lead the nation. It was close, but led the nation in scoring for a second year in a row. In his last game at the Horseshoe, maybe you guys have heard of this, maybe you have not, an epic performance. He had 3 rushing touchdowns, 2 passing touchdowns. He kicked 4 extra points. He had 3 interceptions on defense. And he punted 3 times for a 50-yard average. So 150 yards total. In a 40-0 beatdown of the Buckeyes as a senior in his last game. All they could do was stand and applaud for this young man at the time who eventually became, like I said, a movie star. Had it all. Tom Harmon. Man. Who can back that guy up? Well, a fullback. Bob Westfall in 1941 was an All-American. He was drafted 5th overall. Bob had 808 rushing yards in 1940, making him and Harmon a formidable duo in that season. Bill Daly came along later, another fullback in 1943, an All-American. He was drafted 7th overall. Bill had 817 yards in 6 games for Michigan. 6 games. After he won the Little Brown Jug for Minnesota the previous 3 years. This guy joined the forces and was relocated to Ann Arbor. So why not? Join the team while I'm here. And he did. Different times. And then he won the jug for Michigan at fullback. So he's the only player to ever win the Little Brown Jug for both teams. Tom Kuzma in 1944 was drafted 22nd overall. So he's the first Michigan running back that was drafted. And he was not an All-American, which is interesting. So he was drafted then. Paul White in 1944 was also drafted 101st overall. He played, and then he went to fight in the war, and then he came back and played again at Michigan. Don Lund in 1945, drafted 7th overall as a fullback. He went pro in baseball. Bob Weiss in 1945 as well, drafted as a fullback, 39th overall. Bob filled in at quarterback one year, going 8-1 for Michigan. Then he returned to fullback and went 6-1. So these are the kind of athletes and players. That's page 1. We got 3 more, so stay tuned. But that's the kind of athletes that Michigan has here. The team, baby, the team. Bob Chappius. Chappis. I don't know if I said that any different, but he played quarterback as well as halfback. He was an All-American. He broke the Big 9 record at the time for total offense in 2 seasons, 1946 and 1947. Bem Elliott in 1947 was also an All-American. He led the Big 9 in scoring and would later be a head coach for the University of Michigan. Jack Weisenberger in 1948 was drafted 38th overall. He won a national championship after a broken jaw. So he played after a broken jaw and won it all. Dick Kempthorne in 1949 was an All-American. He was drafted 123rd overall and won 2 national championships as fullback. All them early players won titles basically for Michigan. I didn't feel the need to bring them up, but they're over the years is scarcer for Michigan up till 2023. Wally Taninga in 1949 was drafted 166th overall at age 17. He started 7 games for the University of Michigan. So I think he was the youngest, still maybe the youngest, to ever start at running back for Michigan. Chuck Ortman in 1950 was a 2-time All-American. Chuck punted in the infamous Snow Bowl versus Ohio State, where he had punted 24 times for 723 yards. That still and forever will be a record at the University of Michigan. As a halfback, he threw for 2,078 yards in 3 seasons as a starter, as a halfback. So, wow, that's pretty impressive. And then in 1951, Don Dufek Sr. was drafted 205th overall. He was the 1950 Rose Bowl MVP as a fullback. Don Peterson in 1952 was drafted 196th overall. He was team MVP. Ted Kress in 1954 drafted 344th overall. So, the draft is starting to not like our running backs now as much as they did before. Maybe because they fizzle out of the NFL earlier than they should have. But, man, Ted Kress, he ran for 966 yards, passed for 797 yards in 2 seasons. Fred Bear was a fullback in 1955. He was drafted 161st overall. I thought Michigan native Ted Nugent made that guy up. But Fred Bear, there you go. Lou Baldacci in 1956 started at quarterback, but evolved to halfback over the years. Couldn't pass the ball apparently good enough, but he was drafted 111th overall. Tony Branoff in 1956 as well was drafted 269th overall. His knee injuries cost him, from what I see from the research. He tried to give it a go at wide receiver, just couldn't do it. And then in 1957, Jim Pace was an All-American. Finally, another All-American. Drafted 8th overall. He had 10 touchdowns in his last season. 7 rushing, 2 receiving, and 1 punt return touchdown. John Herrnstein in 1959 was drafted 252nd overall as a fullback. 3rd-generation player there at the University of Michigan. Daryl Harper, 1960, was drafted 171st overall. He had 309 rushes, 137 receiving, and 131 passing in 1958. Running back still ran and passed and blocked at this time. Benny McRae in 1961 was an All-American. He had 1,037 rushing yards, 411 receiving yards, 465 return yards, and 171 punt return yards in 1 season, totaling 2,000 84 all-purpose yards that season. So in 1961, he dominated for us. Bill Tunnicliffe in 1962 was drafted 63rd overall as a fullback. Ken Turan in 1962 as well as a fullback. Same year, two fullbacks. He went 102nd overall. Mel Anthony in 1965, another fullback, 223rd overall. Okay, get back to the running backs here, our halfbacks. And Jim Detweiler in 1967 was drafted 20th overall. He won the Rose Bowl, but a fumble of his cost us a national championship versus Minnesota. He came back and he avenged himself in the next year, but Carl Ward drafted 83rd overall. And then Ron Johnson in 1967 played with these two other guys. He was an All-American. He was drafted 20th overall. Ron was Michigan's first black captain, and he had 1,017 yards in 7 games one time in a season, including a single game rushing record at Michigan, which was 47 rushing yards on 31 carries and 11.2 average, and that was versus Ohio State. Garvey Craw in 1970 was drafted 343rd overall. He scored twice versus Ohio State in the 1969 game versus Ohio State, where Woody said, "You'll never win another one like that," or something, right? Bill Taylor, 1971, was an All-American, and he was drafted 109th overall. Bill broke the career rushing record in 3 years, which was 3,072 yards, but this would not last for long. Fritz Seifert, 1972, was drafted 419th overall and was primarily a blocker for Bill Taylor. So there you go. Now we're on to page 3. Gotta wet my whistle. Ed Shuttlesworth in 1974 was drafted 37th overall. He went 21-1 as a starter. Ed was our lead rusher in 1972 and 1973. His 532 career carries was the most at the time. With him playing the same season, drafted in the same season, Bob Thornblaw was drafted 275th overall as a fullback. He had 11 career rushing touchdowns. Gil Chapman in 1975 was drafted 166th overall. He had over 2,500 yards in 3 years. 1,090 of those were return yards. Chuck Heater, 1975, was drafted 41st overall. Excuse me, starting to try to talk too fast. We got a long way to go. Sorry, excuse me. Take a breath. It's been a long day. I hope you guys are all braving the heat out there lately. It's been brutal, even in Michigan. All right. Chuck Heater was drafted 241st overall. During Chuck and Gil's time at Michigan, they went 41-3-1. Chuck had 1,995 rush yards in his career at Michigan. That's pretty good. All right. And then Bob Lytle came and broke some records. In 1976, an All-American. He was drafted 45th overall. Lytle had 3,307 rushing yards in his career, which was a record that will be broken again many more times. But he had 1,469 rushing yards in one season. Not too shabby. Gordon Bell in 1976 was drafted 104th overall. Bell was Michigan's third 1,000-yard rusher in a season. He only started 3 times of 11 games in that season, so that's pretty remarkable. Fullback Russell Davis in 1979 was drafted 86th overall. 523 rushes So he tied, or no, he was just shy of Shuttlesworth for the most rushes in a career, but he had 2,560 rushing yards and 18 rushing touchdowns in 4 seasons as fullback. Harlan Huckabee in 1979 also was drafted 120th overall. Butch Woolfolk came in 1989. He was an All-American. He was drafted 18th overall. Butch had 3,861 yards in 3 years at Michigan. Stan Edwards in 1982 was drafted 72nd overall. Had 468 carries for 2,206 yards and 14 touchdowns in 4 years. Lawrence Ricks followed him in 1983. So it's like every year, every other year, every 7 years, we got a guy. That's amazing. That's the Michigan way. Ricks was drafted 220th overall. He had 541 carries for 2,751 yards and 24 touchdowns in 4 years at Michigan. Then Bob Perriman, a fullback, in 1987 was drafted 79th overall. He had 1,247 yards and 14 touchdowns in 4 seasons. Thomas Wiltshire in 1987 was drafted 226th overall as well. And then Jamie Morris happened, broke a lot of records, still one stands today. In 1988, he was drafted 109th overall. His 6,201 all-purpose yards still leads the University of Michigan for a career. Morris has 4,392 rushing yards, including 1,703 in 1 season. Morris set many records at Michigan at the time, like I said. Leroy Horde in 1990, the year I was born, was drafted as a junior, the first junior back, I think, to go, 45th overall. He was the MVP of the 1989 Rose Bowl, and he had a lot of great games, a lot of rushing yards. All right, fullback Gerard Bunch in 1991 was drafted 27th overall, 311 carries for 1,346 yards and 8 touchdowns in 4 years. John Vaughn, after that, in 1991, was drafted 112th overall, Michigan's first back to have consecutive 200-yard games. Tony Bowles in 1991 was drafted 291st overall, had 1,408 yards as a sophomore in his sophomore season, but injuries took a toll on him. Enter Tyrone Wheatley in 1993. All-American he was. First at running back since Butch Woolfolk years before. He was the drafted 17th overall after a great career at Michigan. 688 rushing attempts for 4,187 rushing yards. That's a 6.1 average for his career at Michigan. He had 47 rushing touchdowns. He also had 510 receiving yards and 6 receiving touchdowns in his 4 years. After him, 3 years later, Tim Biakapatuka came along, 1996, and he was drafted 8th overall after a 1,818-yard season, including 313 yards versus Ohio State. Still the second most in a game for a Michigan back versus anybody all time. All right, but as you've noticed, we have fullbacks, we have halfbacks, one takes away from another. So no one's going to break records. Same with the quarterback position. We're not going to break records here, but we're going to be damn good when we do what we do. And then in 1988, Chris Floyd, last page, promise. 1988, Chris Floyd was drafted 81st overall. Part of a national championship with 623 yards in 4 seasons. Chris Howard, though, was the guy in 1988, drafted 153rd overall. He had 4 100-yard games and 1,214 all-purpose yards in 1997 on way to a national championship. Anthony Thomas in 2001 was drafted 38th overall. Anthony broke all the records for the time. The A-Train had 550 yards as a freshman for the 1997 national title team. He and his 1,333 yards in 2000 is still number 2 all time. He finished with 4,472 career rushing yards, which was first at the time, beating Jamie Morris. His 56 touchdowns also set a record for the time, later beat by the GOAT, the Great, Blake the Great. But is he the GOAT? Comment down below. Is Blake the greatest of all these? Who knows? Anyway, we're still talking about Anthony Thomas, and he had 6 games with 150 or more rushing yards in the year 2000. Chris Perry in 2003 was an All-American, drafted 26th overall. Chris had 1,647 yards and 18 touchdown rushing in his final season. He had 3,069 yards in 4 years. B.J. Askew was drafted in 2003. B.J. is the first all-time at Michigan, and receiving yards is all I could get for him from the interwebs. Mike Hart, though, 2006, we all remember him. All-American. He had the heart. Never fumbled the ball, right? Except for one crucial time, maybe. But drafted 202nd overall. Hart started as a freshman and had 1,015 carries for 5,040 yards at Michigan, which are still both Michigan records. Chris Evans, then the dark age, like I said, where nobody from Mike Hart till Chris Evans in 2021 were either All-Americans or drafted. We had many in between, like Ron Higdons and the Fitz Toussaints of the world, Charbonnets, but not good enough to list on this all-time great depth chart that Michigan has. So that's the criteria. All-American or being drafted. Chris Evans was drafted, and he was drafted 202nd overall. He had 320 carries for 1,795 yards, 49 receiving yards for 479 yards receiving. So receptions for receiving. Not too bad. Fullback. Ben Mason was drafted first fullback since Chris Floyd, way back, was drafted. 184th overall. He had 7 touchdowns as a sophomore, and he was a beast of a blocker, basically the rest of the time. Hassan Haskins in 2021 was an All-American, and he was drafted 131st overall. Haskins had 1,327 yards and 20 touchdowns in his final season. Remember, all these guys had to compete with each other, and Blake the Great had to compete with him, and he's next. Corum was a 2-time All-American at Michigan in 2023. He was drafted 83rd overall in 2024. Corum had 3,737 career yards at Michigan, but his 58 rushing touchdowns is number 1 all time. As a senior, he had 258 carries for 1,245 yards and 27 touchdowns, which is a record for a season by 7, by far. Blake was the only FBS player to score in every game he played last season en route to a national championship for the University of Michigan. So who's the best all time? What do you got? Leave it in the comments below. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Like the video, share, subscribe, and go blue.